Death Row Appeals: Understanding the Psychology of Long-Term Incarceration. This documentary examines the psychological and legal aspects of the death penalty appeals process in the United States. All information is presented for educational purposes, drawing from peer-reviewed research, legal documentation, and expert analysis. This content is intended to foster understanding of complex criminal justice issues. The American death penalty system operates differently than most people imagine. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution now exceeds 20 years. Some individuals spend 3 or even 4 decades pursuing legal appeals while confined in maximum security facilities. This creates a unique psychological environment that researchers have studied extensively over the past 40 years. This documentary explores what happens to human psychology during prolonged periods of legal uncertainty, how the appeals process functions, and what this reveals about the American criminal justice system. We'll examine documented cases, review academic research, and consider perspectives from psychologists, legal scholars, and those directly affected by these processes. Understanding the legal framework. The death penalty appeals process in the United States contains multiple stages designed to ensure thorough review before an execution proceeds. After initial sentencing, cases typically move through state appellate courts, state supreme courts, and then into federal habeas corpus review where constitutional questions are examined. Each stage involves detailed legal analysis. Attorneys examine trial records for errors, constitutional violations, or new evidence that might warrant reconsideration. Courts review these arguments under specific legal standards that balance the need for finality in criminal proceedings with the irreversible nature of capital punishment. According to legal researchers, this multi-layered review process reflects an attempt to minimize the risk of executing innocent individuals or those whose trials contain significant legal problems. However, the process creates temporal effects that psychologists find particularly interesting from a mental health perspective. The psychology of extended legal uncertainty. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, has conducted research on capital punishment psychology for over 4 decades. His peer-reviewed studies document specific psychological patterns that emerge during prolonged death row confinement combined with ongoing legal proceedings. Haney's research identifies what he terms temporal disorientation, where individuals develop altered relationships with time. Unlike typical life circumstances where people plan for uncertain but presumably lengthy futures, death row inmates exist in a state where their future timeline remains radically unclear. They may have months or decades remaining, depending on legal outcomes they cannot control. This creates what psychologists call chronic anticipatory stress. Research published in legal psychology journals documents elevated anxiety levels, disrupted sleep patterns, and difficulty maintaining stable emotional states among long-term death row populations. The uncertainty itself becomes a significant stressor, separate from confinement conditions. Mental health professionals who work within correctional systems report that inmates with active appeals often focus intensely on legal developments. Court filing deadlines, hearing dates, and judicial decisions structure their psychological experience of time. When favorable developments occur, mood elevation is documented. When appeals are denied, clinicians observe corresponding mood declines. Case study: extended time on death row. Nicholas Sutton spent 34 years on death row in Tennessee before his execution in February 2020. His case involved multiple appeals addressing various legal questions including trial procedure, constitutional issues, and sentencing considerations. Court records show his legal team filed numerous motions over 3 decades, each presenting different arguments for why his conviction or sentence warranted reconsideration. Sutton's case illustrates how the appeals process extends over multiple decades in practice. During this period, individuals age significantly while confined in restrictive housing units designed for maximum security. Medical researchers studying death row populations note accelerated health decline compared to general population inmates, likely related to stress, limited physical activity, and restricted healthcare access. The psychological impact of such extended periods remains a subject of academic study. Researchers examine how individuals adapt to environments where they simultaneously must accept an eventual execution while pursuing legal strategies to prevent that outcome. This psychological paradox interests scholars studying human resilience and adaptation. The role of legal representation. The relationship between death row inmates and their attorneys takes on particular significance given the life-or-death nature of the legal work. Capital defense attorneys often work with the same clients for many years, sometimes decades, pursuing complex legal strategies through multiple court systems. Public defender organizations and capital defense clinics report that this long-term advocacy relationship affects both parties. Attorneys invest enormous time reviewing trial transcripts, investigating new evidence, and researching evolving constitutional law. Success rates for habeas corpus appeals remain relatively low, approximately 13% according to federal court statistics, yet attorneys continue pursuing every available legal avenue. For inmates, their attorney represents their primary connection to the legal system and their best hope for sentence modification. Mental health professionals observe that news from attorneys, whether positive or negative, significantly affects inmate psychological states. Court victories produce hope and renewed energy. Denials create disappointment that can last weeks or months. This dynamic creates what psychologists term intermittent reinforcement, a pattern where occasional positive outcomes maintain ongoing engagement despite predominantly negative results. Behavioral psychology research shows this pattern can be particularly powerful in sustaining long-term behavior patterns. Examining wrongful convictions. The issue of factual innocence adds another dimension to death penalty appeals. The Innocence Project and similar organizations have documented numerous cases where new evidence, often DNA testing unavailable at trial, has exonerated individuals previously convicted of capital crimes. Anthony Porter spent 16 years on death row in Illinois for a double homicide he did not commit. Court records show he came within 50 hours of execution before receiving a stay for competency evaluation. Subsequently, journalism students from Northwestern University investigated his case and identified evidence pointing to a different perpetrator. Porter was exonerated in 1999. Porter later described his experience in media interviews, discussing the psychological impact of maintaining innocence while appeals were repeatedly denied. Mental health researchers studying wrongful conviction cases note a particular form of psychological distress when individuals believe the legal system is rejecting truth. This creates what psychiatrists call moral injury, different from typical trauma because it involves betrayal by institutions one expected to provide justice. The Cameron Todd Willingham case in Texas raised similar concerns. Willingham was executed in 2004 for arson that caused his daughter's deaths. Subsequently, multiple fire science experts reviewed the evidence and concluded that the fire investigation methods used at trial were based on outdated theories no longer considered scientifically valid. Post-execution reviews suggested the fire may have been accidental rather than intentional arson. Cases like these fuel ongoing debates about death penalty reliability and whether procedural safeguards adequately protect against irreversible errors. Legal scholars continue examining how courts balance finality concerns with new evidence claims in habeas corpus proceedings. Mental health considerations in capital cases. The intersection of mental illness and capital punishment presents complex legal and ethical questions. Research published in forensic psychology journals indicates that mental illness rates among death row populations exceed those in general prison populations, which already show elevated rates compared to the general public. The case of Andre Thomas in Texas illustrates these complexities. Thomas was convicted of capital murder in 2004. While in custody, he experienced severe psychiatric episodes requiring hospitalization. Court records document ongoing legal proceedings addressing questions about his mental capacity and whether his psychiatric condition affects the constitutionality of his sentence. The Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violates constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. However, defining intellectual disability and establishing it through legal proceedings remains contentious. Psychological evaluations, IQ testing, and adaptive functioning assessments all factor into these determinations. Mental health professionals working in correctional settings report that the stress of death row confinement can exacerbate pre-existing psychiatric conditions or trigger new episodes in vulnerable individuals. Providing adequate mental health care in maximum security environments presents ongoing challenges that correctional systems continue addressing. The phenomenon of waiving appeals. Approximately 10% of executions carried out since 1977 involved individuals who voluntarily waived their remaining appeals, according to Death Penalty Information Center data. This phenomenon, termed volunteer executions by legal scholars, raises questions about autonomy, mental health, and whether such decisions reflect genuine choice or psychiatric deterioration. Gary Gilmore became the first person executed after the death penalty's reinstatement in 1976. He actively opposed legal efforts to halt his execution, creating legal and ethical debates about whether the state should honor an inmate's desire to be executed when that desire might reflect mental health crisis rather than reasoned choice. Psychological research on individuals who waive appeals shows elevated rates of depression and hopelessness. Some researchers argue that the decision to stop fighting represents adaptation to unbearable circumstances rather than true suicidal ideation. Others contend that years of confinement and repeated legal setbacks create psychiatric conditions that undermine decision-making capacity. Courts must determine whether individuals who wish to waive appeals possess sufficient mental competency to make that choice. This creates paradoxical situations where someone may be competent enough to be executed but perhaps not competent enough to decide to stop pursuing appeals. Legal ethicists continue debating these boundaries. The impact of prolonged proceedings on families. Death penalty cases affect multiple groups beyond the convicted individual. Families of defendants experience their own form of prolonged uncertainty, maintaining relationships with someone they may eventually lose while navigating complex emotions about the crimes involved. Research on families of death row inmates documents chronic stress, difficulty with closure, and complicated grief processes. These families often attend legal hearings, maintain correspondence, and organize clemency campaigns while dealing with social stigma and their own processing of the underlying crimes. Victims' families also experience extended impacts from prolonged appeals processes. Many victim family members support capital punishment and view execution as necessary for justice and closure. For them, appeals represent delays in achieving that closure, requiring them to revisit traumatic events repeatedly over many years. Other victim family members come to oppose capital punishment or their loved one's killer's execution, sometimes after years of reflection. They describe the appeals process and execution proceedings as causing additional trauma rather than providing healing. These varied responses reflect the deeply personal nature of how different individuals process grief and justice needs. Evolving legal standards and their effects. Constitutional law regarding capital punishment continues evolving through Supreme Court decisions that establish new standards or clarify existing ones. These changes affect pending cases and create bases for new appeals even in older cases. When the Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that executing individuals who committed their crimes while under 18 violates the Eighth Amendment, this retroactively affected death row inmates who had been sentenced as juveniles. Similarly, the 2002 ruling on intellectual disability created new legal questions in numerous pending cases. These evolving standards mean that legal landscapes shift during the decades-long appeals processes. Arguments that courts rejected under previous standards may become viable under new precedents. This creates both hope for inmates whose cases might benefit from new rulings and frustration for those seeking finality. Legal scholars debate whether this evolutionary process represents the justice system appropriately adapting to improved understanding, or whether it creates unpredictable inconsistency that undermines public confidence in legal proceedings. Current trends in capital punishment. The use of capital punishment in the United States has declined significantly over the past 2 decades. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, fewer death sentences are imposed annually, and fewer executions are carried out compared to peak periods in the 1990s and early 2000s. Multiple factors contribute to this decline. Public opinion on capital punishment has shifted, with polls showing decreased support compared to previous decades. Some states have abolished the death penalty through legislative action or judicial decisions. Others maintain capital punishment statutes but rarely impose death sentences in practice. Recent policy changes have affected death row populations. In December 2024, President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 individuals on federal death row, converting their sentences to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. This represented the largest single use of presidential clemency power in modern capital punishment history. Despite overall declines, some states continue active death penalty systems. Florida carried out 17 executions in 2025, representing a significant portion of all executions nationwide that year. This geographic variation creates different experiences for death row populations depending on their location. The question of purpose. Criminal justice scholars examine what purposes capital punishment serves in the modern American legal system. Traditional justifications include retribution, deterrence, and incapacitation. Research on each of these rationales continues, with scholars reaching varying conclusions about how well capital punishment achieves these goals. Retribution theory holds that certain crimes warrant proportional punishment, including death. Proponents argue this reflects societal moral standards and provides appropriate response to particularly heinous crimes. Critics question whether state-sanctioned execution achieves moral purposes or perpetuates violence. Deterrence research examines whether capital punishment prevents future crimes. Multiple studies have produced conflicting results, with some finding modest deterrent effects and others finding none. The National Research Council reviewed this research in 2012 and concluded that existing studies were insufficient to determine whether capital punishment has deterrent effects on homicide rates. Incapacitation, ensuring convicted individuals cannot commit future crimes, is achieved through execution but also through life imprisonment without parole. This raises questions about whether permanent incapacitation requires execution or whether alternative sentences achieve the same protective goals. The experience of long-term confinement. Death row housing typically involves restrictive conditions designed for maximum security. Inmates spend the majority of their time in cells, with limited opportunities for programming, education, or social interaction compared to general prison populations. Correctional researchers studying these environments note that such conditions, even without the added stress of pending execution, affect mental health. Prolonged isolation reduces social skills, increases anxiety, and can trigger psychiatric symptoms even in previously healthy individuals. The combination of restrictive housing and legal uncertainty creates what some researchers call a double burden. Individuals must adapt to severe confinement conditions while simultaneously managing the psychological stress of their legal situation. This requires ongoing psychological adjustment that challenges even resilient individuals. Some death row populations have access to educational programs, religious services, or limited recreation. Research shows that access to meaningful activities helps maintain psychological stability. Correctional systems vary in what programming they offer to death row populations, creating different experiences across jurisdictions. Examining the appeals success rate. Understanding why most appeals fail helps contextualize the experience of pursuing legal relief. Federal habeas corpus review, a major stage in capital appeals, operates under legal standards that make relief difficult to obtain. Courts generally defer to state court factual findings and must identify clear constitutional violations to grant relief. Procedural bars prevent courts from considering claims that were not properly raised in earlier proceedings. This means that even potentially meritorious issues may be forever waived if they were not presented at the right time or in the right way. These procedural rules, while serving judicial efficiency purposes, create situations where legal technicalities prevent examination of substantive questions. When appeals do succeed, relief most often involves sentence reduction rather than complete exoneration. Courts may find that a death sentence was improperly imposed while upholding the underlying conviction. This results in resentencing to life imprisonment rather than release. The small percentage of cases that result in complete exoneration typically involve new evidence that definitively establishes innocence, such as DNA testing that excludes the convicted person or identification of an alternative perpetrator with compelling proof. These cases, while statistically rare, have significant impact on death penalty debates and policy discussions. Psychological resilience and adaptation. Despite the challenging circumstances, psychological research documents that many long-term death row inmates develop adaptive strategies that allow them to maintain relative stability. These coping mechanisms interest researchers studying human resilience under extreme stress. Some individuals develop structured daily routines that provide a sense of control and normalcy. Reading, writing, artistic pursuits, or religious practices can provide meaning and purpose. Maintaining relationships with family members or correspondents offers social connection that helps preserve psychological well-being. Mental health professionals working with this population note that maintaining hope, even modest hope, appears protective against depression and despair. This hope need not be unrealistic. Rather, it involves focusing on aspects of life that remain within one's control, such as personal growth, relationships, or creative expression. Research on post-traumatic growth suggests that some individuals find meaning even in extremely difficult circumstances. Some death row inmates become advocates for justice reform, mentors to younger inmates, or contributors to public discourse through writing or legal advocacy. These purpose-driven activities provide psychological benefits by creating legacy and meaning beyond their immediate circumstances. The role of clemency. Executive clemency represents a final avenue for sentence modification outside the judicial system. Governors in most states and the president at the federal level possess authority to commute death sentences or grant pardons based on mercy considerations that go beyond strict legal analysis. Clemency decisions consider factors like rehabilitation, changed circumstances, questions about proportionality, or doubts about the case. Unlike appeals, which focus on legal errors, clemency can simply reflect a judgment that execution is not the appropriate outcome regardless of legal correctness. Historically, clemency was granted more frequently in capital cases than in recent decades. Current data shows that clemency grants have become increasingly rare, with governors often reluctant to exercise this authority due to political considerations. This shift means that clemency, once a meaningful safety valve, now offers limited practical hope. When clemency is granted, it typically converts death sentences to life imprisonment without parole. Recipients remain incarcerated but no longer face execution. This provides certainty that eliminates the particular stressors of death row while maintaining incapacitation and punishment. Examining international perspectives. The United States is one of few developed democracies that maintains active death penalty systems. Most European nations, Canada, Australia, and many Latin American countries have abolished capital punishment. This international context informs American debates about the practice. International human rights organizations argue that prolonged death row confinement itself constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment under international law standards. Some foreign courts have ruled that extraditing individuals to face American death penalty prosecution violates human rights obligations unless assurances are provided that the death penalty will not be sought. Comparative research examines crime rates, public safety, and justice system functioning in countries with and without capital punishment. These studies find no consistent evidence that countries with capital punishment achieve better public safety outcomes than those without it. This evidence informs policy debates about whether capital punishment serves necessary functions or represents an outdated practice. American proponents of capital punishment argue that each nation must make its own determinations about appropriate criminal sanctions based on its values, legal traditions, and public will. They note that democratic processes should determine these policies rather than international pressure. The future of death row in America. Current trends suggest continued evolution in American capital punishment practices. The number of individuals on death rows nationwide has declined from peak levels, both through executions and through sentence commutations or reductions. New death sentences are imposed less frequently than in previous decades. Legal challenges continue in multiple areas, including execution methods, intellectual disability determinations, racial disparities in sentencing, and adequacy of trial representation. These ongoing cases may produce new Supreme Court rulings that further shape capital punishment law. Public policy debates reflect divided opinions about whether capital punishment should continue. Polling shows that while majority support remains for capital punishment in abstract terms, that support decreases when alternative sentences like life without parole are presented as options. Younger generations show less support for capital punishment than older generations. Economic analyses note that capital punishment systems cost significantly more than life imprisonment alternatives due to complex trial requirements, mandatory appeals, and specialized housing costs. Some jurisdictions cite these financial considerations in debates about whether to maintain capital punishment systems. Understanding the human dimensions. Beyond legal and policy questions, the death penalty appeals process represents a profoundly human experience. Individuals spend decades in circumstances most people cannot fully imagine, pursuing legal strategies with uncertain outcomes while managing the psychological weight of potential execution. Family members on all sides, both of defendants and victims, navigate complex emotions over extended timeframes. Legal professionals invest years of their careers in individual cases. Correctional staff maintain these facilities and interact daily with death row populations. Judges make decisions with life or death consequences. Each case represents multiple human stories intersecting with legal systems, societal values, and institutional processes. Understanding these human dimensions helps illuminate why death penalty debates generate such passionate responses and why consensus remains elusive. Concluding reflections. The death penalty appeals process in the United States creates a unique intersection of law, psychology, and human experience. The extended timelines involved mean that individuals spend significant portions of their lives in a state of legal and existential uncertainty unlike almost any other human circumstance. Research documents specific psychological impacts of this situation, including altered time perception, chronic stress, and adaptive responses that allow many individuals to maintain relative stability despite challenging conditions. Legal outcomes remain uncertain throughout extended appeals processes, with small percentages of cases ultimately receiving relief through judicial or executive action. The system reflects ongoing tensions between finality and accuracy, between punishment and mercy, between societal retribution and individual redemption. These tensions generate continuing debates among legal scholars, mental health professionals, policymakers, and the public about whether current practices serve justice appropriately or whether fundamental reforms are needed. As capital punishment practices continue evolving, the experiences of those who have spent decades on death row provide important data for understanding what these systems cost in human terms and whether those costs serve purposes that justify their continuation. These questions remain open, subject to ongoing research, legal developments, and democratic deliberation about the role of capital punishment in American society. This documentary has examined these issues from multiple perspectives, reviewing documented research, legal frameworks, and human experiences to foster informed understanding of this complex aspect of American criminal justice. The goal has been education rather than advocacy, providing factual foundation for viewers to develop their own informed perspectives on these important questions.